When billionaire CEO Philip Anderson walked into the upscale restaurant for a business dinner at 7:32 p.m. on a Thursday and saw his waitress, he froze mid-step so abruptly his business partners nearly crashed into him, confusion and irritation flashing across their faces before they registered that something was wrong, that Philip had gone completely still. In that way people do when they've just seen a ghost or received news that rearranges their understanding of reality. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, with dark skin that caught the restaurant's soft lighting and eyes that suggested intelligence and exhaustion in equal measure. Not because she looked familiar, though she did in that nagging way where, you've seen someone before but can't place the context, can't connect the face to a name or a moment or a story that explains the recognition. But because his 86-year-old father, with advanced dementia, who hadn't recognized Philip's face in 3 years, despite weekly visits where Philip sat beside Harold's bed and held his hand and told him stories about his childhood, hoping something would spark some flicker of memory that never came, who couldn't remember his own name most days, or where he was, or what year it was, or who the strangers were that kept telling him they loved him, who lived in a memory care facility where most staff were people he'd forget 5 minutes after meeting them, had looked at this woman's photo that morning and said with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity Philip hadn't heard from his father since before the diagnosis 6 years ago. "Son, that waitress looked after me at the nursing home when I was dying. She saved my life." And Philip, who'd been told by every neurologist and specialist and memory care expert that his father would never have another lucid moment, that the dementia had progressed too far, that Harold Anderson was essentially gone even though his body kept breathing and his heart kept beating, who'd spent 6 years watching the disease steal his father, piece by piece, until the man who'd taught him to ride a bike and throw a baseball and run a company with integrity had been replaced by someone who looked at Philip like he was a stranger invading his space, stared at this young black woman carrying menus, and realized with the kind of certainty that hits you like lightning that he was about to hear a story that would break him completely, would crack open the grief he'd been carrying for 3 years since his father stopped knowing him. Philip Anderson was 52 years old and had built Anderson Technologies into a billion-dollar empire. The kind of success story business schools used as case studies and magazines put on covers with headlines about innovation and leadership, and the American dream manifested through hard work and strategic vision. But all the money in the world, all the success and power and influence he'd accumulated couldn't buy back his father's memories or slow the disease that had been consuming Harold Anderson's mind for 6 years now. 4 of those years spent at Riverside Manor Memory Care Facility where the staff were kind and the rooms were clean, and Philip paid extra for private care that still couldn't stop his father from disappearing into fog that got thicker every month. Philip visited every week, same day, same time, sitting beside Harold's bed and talking about nothing and everything, about the company his father had started 40 years ago that Philip now ran, about grandchildren Harold had forgotten existed, about Margaret, Philip's mother, Harold's wife of 58 years who died 3 years ago, and whose death Harold couldn't remember long enough to grieve properly. Harold hadn't recognized Philip's face in 3 years, would sometimes ask who this man was that kept visiting, why this stranger thought he had the right to hold Harold's hand and cry quietly when he thought Harold was sleeping. But that morning had been different. Philip had arrived for his usual Thursday visit to find Harold sitting up in bed, more alert than Philip had seen him in months, asking for his photo album, the one Margaret had made before she died, filled with pictures from Harold's life, arranged chronologically so he could remember who he'd been before dementia took that knowledge away. Harold had flipped through pages with shaking hands and then stopped on a photo from 2 years ago, from the nursing home's Volunteer Appreciation Day when they'd gathered everyone in the common room for cake and recognition and photographs that most of the residents wouldn't remember by dinner time. Harold's finger, bent with arthritis but steady in that moment, had pointed to a young black woman in the back of the photo, wearing volunteer badge and warm smile. "That's Janelle," Harold had said, his voice clear, coherent, absolutely certain in ways it hadn't been in 3 years. "The waitress. She saved me." Philip had stared at his father, waiting for the moment to pass, for Harold to slip back into confusion like he always did when brief flickers of memory sparked and then died. But Harold had kept looking at the photo, kept saying her name. Janelle. She looked after me when I was dying. She saved my life. Then, as suddenly as the clarity had come, it vanished, and Harold had looked up at Philip with the familiar blank confusion of someone who didn't know where he was or why this stranger was crying. Philip had never heard of anyone named Janelle, didn't recognize her from the photo, didn't know what his father meant by saved my life, didn't understand how Harold could forget his own son, but remember a volunteer from 2 years ago clearly enough to say her name and describe what she'd done. But he'd taken a photo of the picture with his phone, enlarged it until he could see the woman's face and name badge clearly enough to read it. Janelle Brooks. And then he'd decided, with the kind of desperation that comes from 6 years of watching your father disappear, that he would find her. Would ask her what she'd done that had somehow carved itself into Harold's failing memory deeply enough to survive when everything else had been erased. The waitress approaching his table that evening was Janelle Brooks, 29 years old, working the dinner shift at an upscale restaurant where businessmen conducted deals over expensive wine and steaks that cost more than she earned in a day. She didn't recognize Philip initially. Why would she? Just saw another wealthy customer in expensive suit with colleagues who looked impatient to order and get on with whatever important business had brought them here. "Excuse me," Philip said, his voice stopping her before she could recite the specials or take drink orders. "Your name is Janelle?" She nodded, confused by the question, by the way this stranger was staring at her like he'd been searching for her specifically. "Yes," she said carefully, the wariness of someone who'd learned that men asking personal questions in restaurants usually wanted something she wasn't interested in giving. "Did you work at Riverside Manor Nursing Home 2 years ago?" Janelle's face changed completely, the professional waitress smile disappearing, replaced by something that looked like pain and guilt and surprise all crashing together. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of things left behind. "I volunteered there before I had to stop." Philip leaned forward, his business partners forgotten, the entire restaurant fading into background noise that didn't matter. "My father is Harold Anderson. He's been at Riverside for 4 years. This morning, he said your name. First coherent thing he's said in months. Maybe years. He looked at your photo and said you saved his life." Janelle's eyes filled with tears before Philip finished speaking, her hand flying to cover her mouth, the menus she'd been holding clattering onto the table forgotten. "Mr. Harold," she whispered. "He remembered me? After all this time? If you believe that love leaves marks deeper than memory, that the people who show up in our darkest moments somehow stay with us even when everything else fades, subscribe to Love is Kindness for stories about the invisible threads that connect us across time and circumstance. Now tell us, have you ever helped someone who later couldn't remember your name but somehow still knew you mattered? Comment below and let us know where you're watching from." Philip waved his business partners away with the kind of dismissive gesture that comes from decades of being the person who makes final decisions, telling them to order without him, to start the meeting without him, that something more important had just come up, though he couldn't explain what because he didn't fully understand it himself yet. "Please," he said to Janelle, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who'd spent 3 years trying to reach a father who couldn't remember him. "Sit. Tell me what happened. What did you do for my father?" Janelle glanced at her manager, saw him frown at a waitress sitting with customers when she should be taking orders, but Philip caught the look and made another gesture, the kind wealthy men make when they're used to problems disappearing if you throw enough money at them. And suddenly, the manager was nodding and finding someone else to cover Janelle's tables. She sat slowly, carefully, her hands shaking slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I wasn't staff," she started, her voice quiet but steady. "I was just a volunteer. I worked here, at restaurants like this, and I volunteered at Riverside Manor on my days off, 2 years ago before everything fell apart and I had to stop." She explained that her grandmother had lived at Riverside too, same floor as Harold actually, and Janelle had been there constantly those last few months, visiting during lunch breaks and after shifts, and sometimes overnight when her grandmother was having bad days, and Janelle couldn't bear to leave her alone with strangers who were kind, but didn't love her the way family loves. She'd gotten to know the residents on that floor, would stop and talk to them in the hallways, would help feed the ones whose hands shook too much to hold spoons steadily, would sit with the ones who had no family visiting and read to them, or just hold their hands because sometimes human touch matters more than words when you're old and scared and can't remember why you're scared. The incident Harold remembered had happened at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2 years ago. Janelle explained, her eyes distant like she was seeing it again, living through it while she spoke. She'd been visiting her grandmother who was dying. Everyone knew it was coming, but nobody knew when. And Janelle couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still in that uncomfortable visitor chair watching her grandmother struggle to breathe, so she'd walk the halls like she did sometimes when anxiety made staying still impossible. That's when she'd heard it. The choking sounds coming from Harold's room, wet and desperate and terrifying in the way sounds are at 2 a.m. when most of the world is sleeping and death feels closer than usual. She'd found him alone. Harold Anderson, who she'd talked to maybe 5 times during her visits, always so polite even when he couldn't remember her name from one conversation to the next, choking on food he must have tried to eat after waking up confused, turning blue in that way that means you have maybe 90 seconds before the brain starts dying from lack of oxygen. The night nurse was 2 floors up dealing with another emergency, Janelle learned later, and Harold's call button had malfunctioned. He'd pressed it, but no one had come. The signal hadn't reached the nurse's station, one of those terrible coincidences that turn manageable problems into tragedies. Janelle had performed the Heimlich maneuver, something she'd learned in a first aid class she'd taken 3 years earlier for a job that required it. Muscle memory taking over when her conscious mind was screaming that she didn't know what she was doing, that she wasn't qualified, that she should run for help, except there wasn't time. The piece of food, she still remembered it was apple, had come out after the 3rd thrust, and Harold had gasped and coughed and started breathing again, and Janelle had held him while he shook and cried and slowly came back to himself. She'd stayed with him until the nurse arrived, had explained what happened while checking Harold's pulse and making sure he was really okay, not just breathing, but stable. Harold had been conscious through all of it, aware in ways dementia patients sometimes are in moments of crisis when adrenaline clears the fog temporarily. He'd looked at Janelle with tears streaming down his weathered face and said, "You're an angel. What's your name?" And Janelle, exhausted and scared and trying not to think about her own grandmother dying 2 floors below, had answered, "Janelle, Mr. Harold. Just Janelle." Harold had smiled, really smiled, and said with the conviction of someone making a sacred vow, "I'll remember you, Janelle. Promise." But it wasn't in any official records, Janelle explained now, 2 years later, sitting across from Harold's son in a restaurant where she served expensive food to people who could afford to throw away more money than she earned in a week. She wasn't staff, didn't know the protocol for reporting incidents, had just told the night nurse what happened when she finally arrived 10 minutes later. The nurse had thanked her, had documented that Harold had choked but was stable, but in the chaos of that night when multiple emergencies were happening across 3 floors and everyone was stretched too thin, the detail of who had saved him got lost, became a footnote in medical records that didn't capture the full story. Janelle had visited Harold a few more times after that night, had stopped by his room when she was at Riverside seeing her grandmother, but he didn't remember the incident. Dementia had erased it by the next morning, though he always seemed calm around her, would smile when she walked in, even if he couldn't say why she made him feel safe. Then, Janelle's life had fallen apart in the way lives do when you're working class and something goes wrong, and there's no safety net to catch you. Her grandmother had died in April, 2 months after the choking incident, and the medical bills from those final months had destroyed Janelle financially in ways she was still recovering from 2 years later. Her grandmother hadn't had long-term care insurance, had outlived her savings, and Janelle had been covering the gap between what Medicaid paid and what Riverside Manor actually cost, plus medications and specialists and all the expenses that pile up when someone is dying slowly. She'd had to take a second job, couldn't volunteer anymore because every waking hour needed to earn money, had eventually lost her apartment when the bills got too far behind, and spent 6 months living in her car, parking in different lots each night and showering at the gym and trying to hide from her restaurant coworkers that she was homeless, because shame is powerful, even when you're doing everything right and still failing. She'd stopped going to Riverside entirely, partly because she couldn't afford the gas to drive there when she wasn't volunteering, partly because walking those halls without her grandmother felt like grief she couldn't process while also trying to survive. Eventually, she'd stabilized, had gotten this job at a better restaurant, had found a small apartment she could barely afford, but at least it had walls and a door that locked and a bed that wasn't a back seat. But she'd never forgotten the residents, especially Harold. "I think about him often," Janelle said quietly. "Wonder if he's okay. Wonder if he's still there." Philip's internal struggle was written across his face in ways he couldn't hide. Grief and gratitude and anger at a universe that had let his father nearly die when Philip was sleeping in his comfortable bed 40 minutes away, completely unaware that the man who'd raised him was choking alone with a malfunctioning call button and no one coming. He'd been visiting his father for years, every week without fail, had sat beside Harold's bed and held his hand, and tried to pretend it didn't destroy him that his father looked at him like a stranger. Never knew someone had saved Harold's life. Never knew this woman existed. His father couldn't tell him. Dementia had stolen Harold's ability to share his own story. The records didn't capture it. And Janelle had disappeared before Philip could know, before he could thank her, before he could understand that his father was only still alive because a volunteer waitress had been walking the halls at 2 a.m. unable to sleep. "How is Mr. Harold?" Janelle asked, and Philip heard the fear in her voice, the knowledge that 2 years is a long time when you're 86 with dementia, that asking if someone is still there carries weight when you know the answer might be no. Is he still there? Does he know people?" Philip's voice broke before he could stop it, 3 years of grief cracking through the professional composure he wore like armor. "No," he said. "He doesn't recognize me anymore. Hasn't recognized me in 3 years. But this morning, he said your name, perfectly clear, said you saved him, then went back to the fog like it had never lifted." Janelle cried openly then, tears streaming down her face in the middle of an upscale restaurant where other diners were pretending not to stare, her professional mask completely abandoned. He remembered me? After all this time? When he can't remember his own son? Philip nodded, his own eyes wet. "You're the only person from the last 5 years he's remembered," he said. "The only name he's said clearly, the only moment of lucidity he's had. Every doctor told me he'd never have another clear moment, but this morning, he saw your photo and knew exactly who you were." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Philip asked, not accusatory but genuinely confused. "Why didn't you make sure it was documented? Why didn't you make sure I knew?" Janelle shook her head. "I wasn't staff," she repeated. "I didn't think it mattered. I just saw someone who needed help." Philip leaned forward, his voice intense. "You saved my father's life and then disappeared. I've been visiting him for 2 years since then, never knowing what you did, never able to thank you, never able to tell you that he's still alive because of you." "I didn't do it for thanks," Janelle said simply, the truth of it obvious in her voice. "I did it because he was choking, because I knew how to help and he needed help, and that was the whole equation. There wasn't anything else to consider." "You gave my father 2 more years of life," Philip said, his voice breaking around words that felt too small to carry the weight of what he was trying to express. "He's still alive because of you. Because you were walking those halls at 2 a.m. when you could have been sleeping, when you could have ignored sounds that weren't your responsibility, when you could have run for help instead of helping yourself. Those 2 years meant everything to me, even if he didn't recognize me, even if every visit felt like talking to a stranger wearing my father's face. I got to say goodbye slowly. I got to hold his hand. I got to tell him I loved him even if he couldn't say it back, even if he looked at me confused about why this man kept showing up and crying. You gave me that. And you never asked for anything." Janelle shook her head, tears still streaming, her voice thick with emotion she'd been holding back for 2 years. "Your father was kind to me," she said, "even with dementia, even when he couldn't remember conversations we'd had 5 minutes earlier. He had this gentle way. The few times I visited after that night, after I saved him, he didn't remember the incident, couldn't tell you what had happened or why I was there. But he'd smile at me. Didn't know why, couldn't explain it, but he'd smile like his body remembered even when his mind couldn't. That was enough. Knowing he felt safe. Knowing that somewhere deep down, past all the broken connections and lost memories, something in him recognized that I meant him no harm. "What can I do?" Philip asked, leaning forward with the desperation of someone who'd spent 3 years helpless in the face of his father's decline and had suddenly been given an opportunity to actually fix something, to repay a debt he hadn't known existed. "How can I repay you? Tell me." "Anything." Janelle smiled sadly through her tears. "You can't," she said simply. "And you don't need to. I'm just glad Mr. Harold is still here, that he got 2 more years, that he's still breathing. That's payment enough." But Philip shook his head, the stubborn determination that had built a billion-dollar company asserting itself. "Please," he said, "let me do something. Anything. I can't just walk away knowing what you did and do nothing." So Janelle told him, not because she was asking for help, but because he kept pushing and she was too exhausted from 2 jobs and financial stress to keep deflecting. She was working 2 jobs, waitressing here 6 nights a week and cleaning offices on her days off, saving every possible dollar for nursing school because she wanted to become a geriatric nurse, wanted to specialize in Alzheimer's and dementia care. But tuition was expensive, and she was barely keeping her head above water with rent and student loans from her incomplete bachelor's degree and the medical debt from her grandmother that followed her like a shadow. She dreamed of working in memory care, of being the kind of nurse who saw residents as people instead of tasks to be completed before shift change. "My grandmother had Alzheimer's," Janelle explained. "Mr. Harold reminded me of her, the same gentle confusion, the same fear when she didn't know where she was. I want to help families like ours, families watching someone they love disappear piece by piece." Philip didn't hesitate, made the decision with the same swift certainty he used when evaluating business opportunities. Except this wasn't business, this was something more fundamental. Full nursing school scholarship, he said, all expenses paid, tuition, books, living expenses so you can quit one of those jobs and actually have time to study. And when you graduate, if you want it, there's a job waiting for you at Riverside Manor. I'll make sure of it. "Not as payment," he added, seeing Janelle about to protest. "As investment, in someone who already proved they're exactly who should be caring for people like my father." Janelle was overwhelmed, crying harder now, the kind of crying that comes from years of struggling and suddenly having someone offer to remove the obstacles you'd convinced yourself were just part of life you had to endure. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't know if I'll even finish school, if I'll be good at it, if I'll actually help anyone." Philip smiled, the first real smile since he'd recognized her. "I know you saved my father when no one was watching," he said. "When you got nothing from it except the satisfaction of keeping an old man with dementia alive for reasons you couldn't even articulate. When you performed the Heimlich maneuver at 2 a.m. on someone who wouldn't remember you existed by morning. That's all I need to know. That's everything I need to know about who you are and what you'll do with an opportunity." There was one more thing Philip needed to ask, had been building courage for since Janelle started telling her story. "Would you visit him?" he said quietly. "One more time? While he's still here? Before the dementia takes whatever's left?" Janelle didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Of course." They went to Riverside Manor that night, Philip driving them in his car that cost more than Janelle would earn in 5 years, both of them silent during the drive because some moments are too heavy for small talk. Harold was asleep when they arrived, his room dark except for the small lamp the night staff left on so he wouldn't be disoriented if he woke. His breathing steady but labored in the way breathing becomes when you're 86 and your body is tired of working. Janelle sat in the chair beside his bed, the same chair Philip sat in every week, and took Harold's hand gently. His skin was paper thin, spotted with age, the veins prominent in ways that made him look fragile, breakable, like he might dissolve if you held too tight. Harold's eyes fluttered open, not fully awake but not quite asleep either, that in-between state where consciousness is negotiable. He looked at Janelle, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, something that suggested recognition even if he couldn't name what he was recognizing. His lips moved, formed a single word that came out as barely more than a whisper. Angel. Then his eyes closed again, his breathing settling back into the steady rhythm of sleep, his face more peaceful than Philip had seen it in months, maybe years. Philip broke down completely, sitting in the corner of his father's room watching this woman his father had remembered through 3 years of fog, watching Harold recognize her even in his sleep, watching evidence that love leaves marks deeper than memory, that the people who save us somehow stay with us even when everything else has been erased. His father, who hadn't recognized Philip in 3 years, who couldn't remember his own name or his dead wife or the company he'd built, had recognized Janelle Brooks in the space between waking and sleeping and called her Angel like that was her name, like that was the only truth that mattered. 2 years later, the world looked different for everyone involved. Janelle had graduated nursing school at the top of her class, the scholarship Philip provided having removed the financial stress that had been crushing her since her grandmother died, giving her space to actually excel at something she'd been born to do. She worked at Riverside Manor as a geriatric nurse, specializing in Alzheimer's and dementia care, and the residents loved her in the way people love caregivers who see them as human beings instead of problems to be managed. Harold had passed away peacefully 6 months earlier, his body finally giving up after 86 years of living, and 6 years of his mind slowly erasing everything that made him who he'd been. Janelle had been his primary nurse during those final months, had been there when Philip visited, had advocated for his comfort when medical staff suggested interventions that would prolong life without improving quality. And Philip had been there when Harold died, had been holding his father's hand while Janelle held the other, both of them present for the final moment when Harold had one last flicker of clarity 10 minutes before his heart stopped. His eyes had opened, clearer than they'd been in years, and he'd looked at Philip with recognition that made Philip's breath catch. "Son," Harold had whispered. Then he'd looked at Janelle, smiled the way he'd smiled 2 years ago when she'd saved his life, and whispered the word that had become her name in his broken mind. Angel. He'd died holding both their hands, the son who'd never given up visiting, and the nurse who'd saved him twice, once from choking and once from dying alone. Janelle trained other nurses now, taught them not just the medical protocols and documentation requirements, but the deeper truth about caring for people whose minds were failing. Treat them like they're your family, she told new hires during orientation. Because to someone, they are. To someone, that confused elderly person hitting the call button for the 5th time in an hour is the person who taught them to ride a bike, who made them breakfast every morning, who loved them before they knew what love meant. Never forget that. Philip had established a scholarship program, the Janelle Brooks Memorial Fund, named after Janelle's grandmother, who died at Riverside, and whose medical bills had nearly destroyed her granddaughter's future. It helped aspiring nurses from low-income backgrounds, people like Janelle, who had the calling and the competence but not the money, people who'd proven through life experience that they understood what it meant to care for others when resources were scarce. "She saved my father," Philip explained at the fund's launch event. "Now we help her save others' families." Philip Anderson spent 3 years visiting a father who didn't recognize him, watching dementia steal memories they'd built over 52 years, grieving a man who was still breathing but already gone in every way that mattered. And on one ordinary Thursday, he discovered that 2 years earlier, a volunteer waitress named Janelle Brooks had saved his father's life in the middle of the night when no one else was watching, when call buttons malfunctioned and nurses were stretched too thin and Harold Anderson was choking alone in the dark. She didn't save him for recognition or reward or gratitude or any of the reasons people usually help strangers. She saved him because he was choking, and she knew how to help. And that was the entire equation, the whole moral calculation that mattered. But that moment, that single act of seeing an elderly man with dementia as someone worth saving instead of just another patient who wouldn't remember her anyway, gave Philip 2 more years to say goodbye, gave Harold 2 more years of life where his body worked even if his mind didn't, and gave Janelle a future she'd almost given up on when poverty and grief made nursing school feel like an impossible dream. Because sometimes the people we save in the dark, the ones we help when nobody's watching and no reward is coming, become the angels who save us back when morning finally comes. We never see the full impact of small acts of kindness, never know whose life we change when we help someone who can't repay us, who won't remember us, who might not even know we helped. Have you ever helped someone who never knew your name, who couldn't thank you, who forgot you existed, but whose life was different because you showed up anyway? Comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes saving someone's life has nothing to do with whether they remember you, and everything to do with whether you saw them as worth saving in the first place.